In this video, we're going to spend some time attempting to understand a little bit about process capacity and bottleneck and how we can do a couple of things to manage capacity and the bottleneck constraints that exist sometimes in processes. We've already said that process strategy is about producing a product or service to meet customer requirements, but then we often have some constraints that has to do with managerial constraints. And I mentioned things like cost, the use of resources. It could be time as well. So we need to have a sense of the capacity of a process, because if you're going to make a process choice, if you forecast what your likely demand would be on your process, then you have to ensure that the process selection that you make could actually satisfy the demand. So capacity is defined as the throughput or the number of units a facility can hold, receive, store, produce in a period of time. And so when we think about production processes, we're often thinking about the latter part of this, which is the number of units that it could produce in a period of time. If you think about a facility like a concert hall, yes, we'll be talking about the capacity in the context of how many units this can actually hold. It will determine, given the expectation of the process, that will determine how much you have to spend in terms of your fixed costs. The capability of the process will determine to what extent you can satisfy the demand. And we need to look at this capacity decision over three different planning horizons: the short term, the medium term, and the long term. So typically when we are focusing in the short term, capacity issues have to do with our ability to schedule jobs, schedule personnel, allocate machinery, and that has implications on what our throughput can be. At the intermediate level, though, we may consider decisions such as subcontracting, adding additional equipment, adding some shifts. Like, for example, if the Christmas season is a busy time, you may consider adding some additional shifts to create some extra capacity. But that's only temporary, because then you will, when the season is over, you will go back to your sort of default capacity level. And then, of course, we could talk about the long range decision, where we could focus on adding facilities, adding lead time, long lead time equipment. So in a case like that, your decisions are much more strategic. You don't change them very often in that environment. So what's the capacity of a process? How can we measure that? Well, usually we design a process with a sort of a maximum capacity capability, and we call that the design capacity. That is, if everything was perfect, if there were no wait times, here's what we can expect out of that system. The unit production rate is 5 per hour. Then you have 8 hours per day, 8 fives are 40. How many days per year? You multiply by, and that would be your theoretical or your maximum capacity. However, because parts have to wait, they have to be handled, they move from one location to the other, you don't quite get that efficiency, that level of efficiency. So your effective capacity will be less than the design capacity. So effective capacity is the capacity the firm expects to achieve given the current operating constraints. Okay? So maybe you could actually if you produce 3 shifts, you have a maximum capacity, but you're only going to do 2 instead of 3. So now your effective capacity is different, and it's often lower than the design capacity. So we often speak of utilization and efficiency. Utilization has to do with the amount of use of your design capacity. So if it is designed for 500 units per day, but we're only producing 300, we have the 60% utilization of that capability or that capacity. However, efficiency is really a measure of what can we realistically expect. So we look at our effective capacity. If your effective capacity is 400 units, now all of a sudden 3 over 400 gives you 75% efficiency. So your efficiency level tends to be usually higher than your utilization level. Okay? let's take a quick look at an example, a bakery example. So here's what we got. We got the actual production, and then we have the effective capacity, which is different from your design capacity. Now we have to figure out the design capacity based on the number of shifts, the number of hours per shift, and the number of rolls per hour that we can produce. And here's the design capacity: 7 days by 3 shifts by 8 hours times 1200 units per hour gives us 201,600 rolls. So that's the design capacity. But here's the effective capacity is 175 units. So what's our utilization rate? It would be what you actually produce over the design capacity, which is 73.4%. What's our efficiency? It is the 148,000 rolls divided by 175, which is 84.6%. So the efficiency actually looks pretty good. All right. If we wanted to calculate, if we were told that we have a new production line with a given level of efficiency, if we know what the effective capacity is, we could actually figure out what the expected output would be just by manipulating the formula. So the expected output is the effective capacity times the efficiency. So we're basically specifying that the efficiency is 75%, in which case 75% of 175,000, we could expect 131,250 rolls produced out of that facility. Okay? So it just sort of shows you how we can do some basic computations around utilization and efficiency. One of the things to keep in mind is that the decisions you make around capacity will impact a lot of the other areas. The 10 decision areas of OM will have implications for maintenance, scheduling, your product and service design. What can you produce out of that process in terms of its capacity and capability? So the quality that you actually get, what is the capacity and capability in terms of meeting quality expectations and so forth. So keep in mind that the decision has strategic implications because it impacts these other 10 decision areas of OM. And so as a result, when you're designing strategy, the capacity and capabilities of your process must be considered because of the strategic implications. All right? Now, in considering what sort of capacity you need to plan for, it's very important that we consider a few things. One is, what is the likely demand on that facility? That's one. The second thing is, we also need to understand that technology often provides us opportunities, and those opportunities could allow us to actually increase our capacity in increments. So sometimes we have to figure out what is the incremental change in our capacity that we want, and we have to do some typically financial analysis to determine what is the optimum level of capacity increase or capacity change. Largely because if you increase your capacity too high over and above what the expected demand is, the issue is that you have a lot of idle capacity and that will cost you. However, if it is too little, then you're not taking advantage of the potential demand. All right. Other thing you got to keep in mind is that if you go too little, then you may end up having to increase your capacity very frequently, more often, and that could be a potential problem. You need to find the optimum operating volume level. So the sort of analysis that we were just talking about earlier is part of that. And then, of course, build your capacity in such a way that you anticipate some change might happen in the future. If you make it difficult for you to change your capacity levels, it means that whenever change is necessary, it's going to cost you quite a bit to make that change. Because a process that often have a fixed capacity level, in some cases, if the demand is very high, you could either try to build the capacity or you could try to control the demand. So when demand exceeds your capacity, you could curtail demand by raising prices. That means price demand elasticity, schedule longer lead time, make people have to wait longer. So therefore, they're less likely to want to place orders with you. But in the long term, if that continues, that trend continues, you may want to actually consider increasing your capacity. If the capacity exceeds the market demand, then you may want to do some stimulation, price promotions, and so on. And then maybe consider changing your product because your product is just not driving your demand. And of course, you want to consider adjusting to seasonal demands. It's an interesting one. In some cases, if you have complementary demand patterns, that works very, very well. Just think about a manufacturer of jet ski engines, but also snowmobiles. Whoever could design a jet ski engine could also design a snowmobile, but they actually are required at different times of the year. As a result, we could actually get the benefit of the smoothing of demand from those two things because they have a demand pattern that complements each other. So snowmobiles and then jet skis. And if we look at the aggregate demand for the two, we see it's a lot smoother, which allows for better utilization of your capacity. So these are just some tactics that you could use. Or when you have capacity that is actually affected very, very significantly by the seasons, then you want to try to find ways to create products and services that have complementary demand cycles. It has some additional tactics for matching capacity to demand. So in some cases, you might make some staffing changes. If you need more capacity, increase the staff levels, or you may have some layoffs that actually will reduce your staffing capacity level in this case. Adjusting the equipment, purchasing additional machinery in this case, selling or leasing out existing equipment. In some production cases, you might actually be able to change the production rate of equipment so that you actually slow down production instead of increasing it. Improving processes to increase the throughput, redesigning the products to facilitate better throughput, adding process flexibility to meet changing product requirements. In some cases, there's not much you could do. You have excess capacity and you simply have to close the facility, which can be unfortunate sometimes. In the service sector, if you want to match capacity and demand, one of the things we could do for demand management is appointment systems and reservations, or first come first serve rules. These things actually help. And then of course you could consider in terms of your staffing, part-time versus full-time staff, or flexible staff or flex staff, or you have a flex pool that you could draw from that would help you increase or reduce your capacity level whenever you need to. Bottlenecks are important in processes because when you think about process throughput and you examine multiple stages of a process, it is very likely that each stage have a different processing time, a different processing rate. As a result, the throughput of that process, or how fast that process can produce output, is limited by what we call the bottleneck part of that process. So let's take a look at this. So each work area within an organization can have its own unique capacity. So if you think about a manufacturing plant, a part of the plant that deals, for example, with packaging will have its own bottleneck. A part of the plant that actually deals with the manufacturing could have its own bottleneck. A part of the plant that deals with storage and retrieval, warehousing, could have its own bottleneck as well. So sometimes it's useful to do some capacity analysis of these different areas to really understand the throughput of your entire system. Right? So capacity analysis determines the throughput capacity of workstations in a system. The bottleneck is a limiting factor or constraint, and it has the lowest effective capacity in the system. So if you were to take each unit or each area in that process and you determine what's the capacity of each area, the one with the least capacity is the bottleneck operation. And so what you do as an operations person is you try to eliminate that bottleneck. Okay, so how do we actually go about computing things like process time, cycle times, and so on? Let's try to understand the times in a process. So process time of a station is the time to produce a unit at that single workstation. So if at a workstation we're assembling, we're putting two components together, and it takes 5 minutes to do that, then in an hour you could expect to get 12 units produced. So the processing time of that station is 5 minutes. Of the system, however, it is the longest process in the system. So if you have 5 processes and the longest one is 10, so really 10 minutes is that bottleneck time, which then affects in an hour you could only produce 6 units. So that limits your throughput of your system. The process cycle time is the time it takes for the product to go through the entire production process if there were no waiting. All right. So let's just take a look at a 3-line assembly station. If you look at this here, A, B, and C, excuse me, then from the look of this, B is a bottleneck because it takes the most amount of time. So in an hour you can make 30, in an hour you can make 20, but here you could only make 15. So B becomes your bottleneck. And it's important to be able to identify that. So system process time is the process time of the bottleneck after dividing by the number of parallel workstations. So or operations. So what it is that if say a particular activity takes 40 minutes and I have 2 parallel workstations, really the effective time per unit is actually 20 minutes because I'm producing 2 in 40, so 1 in 20. So you have to kind of analyze the parallel operations first before you figure out what your system process time is. The system capacity is the inverse of that process time. And then, of course, so if it takes 5 minutes to do, for your system time is 5 minutes, then 1/5 will give you your throughput rate, the number of units that you make per minute, right? 1/5 of a unit per minute. And then if you want to think about an hour, you multiply by 60, that's where you get 12 units per hour, and so forth. Process cycle time is the total time for the longest path in the system. So let's take a look at an example, which will make that a whole lot clearer. We have 2 identical sandwich lines. The lines have 2 workers and 3 operations. So if you look at it, there's order, then you have bread, fill, toast, and then you have wrapping right here. All completed sandwiches are wrapped. All right. So let's look at this case right here. So if you look at this, it looks like you have 30 seconds per sandwich, 37.5 seconds per sandwich, but here you have 40 seconds per sandwich. Now, if you only had one of these lines, because you have 2 parallel lines here, then this would be your limiting workstation, 40 seconds per sandwich. However, because you have 2 of them, essentially those 2 lines, the effective time at this station is really 20 seconds, sorry, per sandwich. Here it would be 10 seconds per sandwich and 7.5 seconds per sandwich. So we have to divide this time by 2 because we have 2 parallel operations in this case. So in doing the analysis, here's what we got. The toast workstation has the longest processing time of 40 seconds. We've already identified that. The 2 lines each deliver a sandwich every 40 seconds, so the process time of the combined lines is really 20 seconds. Right? So those 2 lines, so 40 seconds will be the limiting factor for this line and that line, but because we're getting 2 sandwiches processed at the same time, then the time is really 20 seconds per sandwich. In which case, if here is 30, this operation is 20, then the wrapping station becomes the bottleneck of 37.5 seconds. So the capacity per hour is 3,600 seconds divided by 37.5 seconds per sandwich, which is approximately 96 sandwiches per hour is what you can process. The process cycle time now is the longest path, so let's just go back here, would be the longest path through that network. And so we go through this with 30 plus, sorry, I think I gotta make sure I get this right. Okay, I'm looking at the wrong thing. So we would have to add up all of these, which is 30 plus 15 plus 20 plus 40 plus 37.5, which then gives us 142.5 seconds is the process cycle time, okay? Here's another example. We're looking at in a dental office, you check in, take an x-ray, develop the x-rays, then you have either cleaning or X-ray exam, and then you have the dentist and the checkout. So those two things are really not in parallel. They look like they're in parallel, but they're not identical operations. So in this case, the longest one will determine the process time. And the bottleneck activity will clearly be at this point because that is the one with the largest unit processing time per unit. Excuse me. So the cleaning path is 46 seconds if we go this way. The path through X-ray is less than that, so 27 seconds, and so therefore that is the constraining operation, cleaning. The longest path involves the hygienist cleaning the teeth, so the bottleneck is the hygienist at 24 minutes. So your hourly capacity, the best you could do is one person every 24 minutes. Once your system is in steady state, and so 60 divided by 24 gives you 2.5 patients per hour. If you want to improve that, then you could probably have 2 hygienists, in which case we get down to 12. And if you go to 12 now, you could double your, you certainly can double the throughput to 5 patients per hour. All right? Then you have to ask yourself, is it worthwhile paying for an extra hygienist to get the 5 patients per hour? Will you be able to generate that consistently throughout the year? In which case you would have the revenues to pay for that additional employee. Theory of constraints. So because all bottlenecks, not bottlenecks, but all processes have a bottleneck, we need to kind of develop a little philosophy, a little approach about eliminating bottlenecks. And Eli Goldratt from Harvard published a book called The Goal. And in that book, he essentially talks about the theory of constraints and offers a 5-step procedure for eliminating constraints in processes. Basically, you identify the constraint, you develop a plan for overcoming that constraint, focus resources on eliminating the constraint, and then you reduce the effect of the constraints by offloading work or expanding the capability. Once you've done that, well, guess what? You've now removed that bottleneck. Somewhere else, the bottleneck has moved to some other location. So now you got to go through the process and repeat it again. So the question is, when do you stop? Well, you stop once you're satisfied with the performance that you're now getting from your improved process. So think of this as a form of continuous improvement of a process, but stopping at the point where you met whatever your performance constraints or performance targets are for that particular process. Okay. So how do we manage bottlenecks? Well, if you know that you have a bottleneck in your process, don't pile everything through that process at a time. You could actually release work into the process at the rate of the bottleneck operation. So that way, because it makes no sense just having, all you will have happen is a big work in process, pile of work in process inventory will sit in front of that bottleneck workstation. So lost time at a bottleneck represents lost time for the whole system, and increasing the capacity of non-bottleneck station is a mirage. It doesn't do anything for you because the bottleneck will determine your throughput. Increasing the capacity of a bottleneck increases the capacity of the whole system. So that's pretty much what we try to do with this. Okay, so understanding the capacity of processes and understanding that all processes have bottlenecks that need to be eliminated, particularly when target performance is not met. There are some strategies for addressing that, and Eli Goldratt talked about that in a book called The Goal, which discusses the theory of constraints.